from good morning to good afternoon. It's just turning the clock. Thank you for making time here attending the final City Forum speaker series. This whole semester we have a line of great speakers on various topics, and we have another semester coming up, and also most of the speakers at end time. Moment I'd like to thank Aisha. Thank you, Aisha, for coordinating the speakers and then also the students, asking students and faculty members the recommendations in terms of topics and speakers, and then we're working on all those logistics. Today we have a speaker from out of town, Professor Ariel Bierbaum. As always, I'll introduce her by reading her bio. Dr. Ariel Bierbaum is an assistant professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Her research is at the intersection of urban politics, planning practice, and educational equity. Her current projects focus on transportation systems in the context of school choice and desegregation, and on public school closures and neighborhood change. Previously, Dr. Bierbaum served as the program director at the UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools, a policy research and technical assistance center that works with city, regional, and state governments and school districts to connect public education with local community development, regional growth management, and federal place-based programs. She has 20 years of experience in the nonprofit and the public sector, working in public policy, community development, and community arts. Dr. Bierbaum sits on the board of 21st Century School Fund and is an advisor to Active Voice Labs and is the future of public initiative. Originally from New Jersey, she earned her PhD in city and regional planning from the University of UC Berkeley, a master from city planning at MIT, and a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Dr. Bierbaum.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I know we're at the end of the semester, so this is sort of, everyone's in the last big push, so I'm hoping that we can have a lively conversation. I'm going to present for about 40 minutes, and there may be some gaps as I sort of speed through, but part of that is because I would love to get to questions and discussion for you, from you, and with you. So I'll briefly talk about why I think about schools in general, why that intersection is meaningful, why I think it's meaningful to planners, and then talk a bit more about specifically school travel. And then today I want to share with you two projects that I'm working on, one in Philadelphia and one in Baltimore, that are both works in progress. So I'm in sort of the early stages, middle to early stages of data collection and analysis, and trying to puzzle through kind of different sets of questions around student transportation. So let me ask you a question. I think our audience is predominantly students. How many of you have taken classes in your planning or design education that have to do with schools, public education? Deafening silence, okay. How many of you come with a background in education as a teacher or an administrator? Two in the crowd, okay. So this doesn't really surprise me. This often happens. But it's an interesting puzzle that so many of us don't see schools in our planning education and don't necessarily come to planning from schools. And it's an interesting puzzle because the way I think about schools are schools as infrastructure, as urban infrastructure or metropolitan infrastructure. So they, of course, are spaces of learning. They're educational infrastructure, but they're also social, physical, and political infrastructure in our cities and in our communities. They're deeply tied to issues of segregation, residential segregation, to how we think about geographies of opportunity across our metropolitan regions. We know there is ample research on the relationship between particular metrics of school quality and housing location choice, and also housing costs and housing values. From a human capital perspective, we can think about ways that schools are positioned as a primary vehicle for social mobility, and at least rhetorically promoted as the tool to mitigate inequality in our society. And there are also large physical buildings. So if you think about where you may have gone to school, they take up space, right? And in many communities, they actually structure the daily physical sort of patterns in a neighborhood or in a community. So when we think about schools in this multifaceted way, as more than just places where kids go to learn, it starts to imply kind of a reciprocal relationship between public education, city planning and city design, and urban politics, right? So the people that are engaged in educational and also educational politics and also the politics of place. And so that's the puzzle where my research sits, right? My goal is to really kind of understand and grapple with the ways that as planners we can actually put schools and young people and families at the center of our work, right? How do we center these folks to gain new understanding about the communities that we live and work in and that we are responsible for designing? And one way to think about this is the way that everything that we do in planning sets the conditions for learning. So everything that a student, a young person experiences before they step foot in that school building, we are largely responsible for, right? So how do we unpack and uncover and reframe our questions to consider that child and that experience in school as an outcome of our work? Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about schools and transportation. I'm happy to talk about other work that I've had if folks are interested as well. But today we're going to talk about transportation. So what do we know about schools and transportation? What do we know about how students get to school, right? Well, we know a fair amount in a particular sort of subset of the world. And a lot of transportation planning literature that focuses on schools and school travel is really preoccupied with the decline in active school travel, active transportation. So in the 1950s and 60s, upwards of 50% or more of students were walking to school or biking to school. And by the mid to late 2000s, that had declined to 15 or 20%, right? So what accounts for this decline, and what are the outcomes of this decline? So we know that there's a set of negative outcomes attached to it, which is that as students are not walking, right, walking and biking is cheap, right? So other modes cost more money. Who they cost is an open question, which we'll talk about. There's also been an increase in rates of childhood obesity and diabetes, which is in part attributed to a lack of exercise and the loss of active travel. And then, of course, we talk a lot about sort of the increase in vehicular traffic has really negative environmental consequences, increased VMT, increased emissions in cities that we are, of course, concerned about as planners and thinking about the sustainability of our communities. And so we've done a lot of research in the scholarly community to kind of unpack why this is happening. And we know that this is a function of demographics. It's a function of household makeup that has changed. We have increasing single-parent households to working households, right, which changes the sort of calculus of logistics of school drop-off and pickup, which maybe some of you understand and manage if you yourself are parents. The condition of the built environment really matters. So you can have a built environment that really enables walking, right, with good urban design, with pedestrian scale infrastructure, with things as basic as sidewalks and crosswalks. And we, of course, know also that distance matters, right? And this is kind of pretty intuitive, right? When things are further away, we are less likely to walk to them. And that is definitely true also of schools. So the next question is, why is distance sort of a really important axis of schools? Because distances are increasing for how children get to school. And so we need to know, why are students traveling farther to school? And I want to take a minute to sort of unpack this, because the reasons that children are traveling farther are really sort of wholly embodied or largely embodied in education policymaking. So there are logics and rationales that we as planners concerned about VMT or concerned about improving health outcomes through active travel don't necessarily see sort of the behind the scenes work, because this is happening in the realm of education policymaking rather than in planning. So the first set of reasons is that in many rural communities, schools have been losing population, and there's been a movement to consolidate schools, which means that students are traveling, who are already traveling pretty far because they're in a rural community, so there's already a large spread. They're traveling even further. And in some rural communities, you'll hear about students that are traveling upwards of 2 hours to get to school, to and from school each way. In more suburban settings, we have various state and local regulations that often mean that schools are siting new schools in greenfields, so they're sort of going away from already built out residential areas and moving students further away. Since the 1950s and 60s, when school desegregation was deemed unconstitutional, districts have been implementing desegregation plans, either under court order or in constructing voluntary desegregation programs. And the idea is to shuffle students in a way that the result is that you have racially and socioeconomically integrated schools. Because of the tie between neighborhood composition and school composition, we often know that this means getting students out of their home neighborhood, right? So we want to get them out of a segregated, racially segregated and potentially high poverty neighborhood and into another school in another neighborhood. And then more recently, probably in the last 20 years or so, there's been a push towards increasing access to opportunity. And given sort of the troubles of the education funding, there's kind of an acknowledgement at a district level, at a state level, that we actually are not going to improve the quality of all schools to a caliber that we need. And so we need to give everyone the chance to access opportunity, to access a different school that maybe is performing better or has a specialized program that students and families would want. And this sort of takes multiple forms, which I'll talk more about in my case studies, but this is sort of where the conversation around a market-based effort that sort of positions schools as an educational marketplace. And so we see the rise of charter schools as a vehicle to school choice. And then other districts actually just have open enrollment. So even in the absence of charter schools, students can kind of choose anywhere in a district where they're going. But what's important about this is that all of these strategies disrupt that link between neighborhood and school, right? They shuffle kids all over the place, which means that for school districts and for families, we have much more complicating routing of getting kids to school. You might have a set of kids on a residential block in a neighborhood. You know, if you have 10 houses, you may have those kids going to 6 different schools. Right? So you no longer can send a yellow school bus, pick up a gaggle of kids on a corner, and take them to sort of the nearest school. And at the same time, districts are cutting funding for transportation. Transportation is not constitutionally guaranteed to a school, even though access to public education is a constitutional guarantee. And for many districts, you will see that the debate that board members and even staff argue that transportation is not a core function of a school district, and so they will cut those fundings. So this kind of new configuration of student assignment, of travel, and complications of school choice kind of raise the question and the specter of kind of needing to look at how does transportation support or hinder educational equity, right? Are we exacerbating inequalities in schools, or are we mitigating them? And at its most basic premise, the idea of access to better schools is really predicated, of course, on getting from point A to point B, right? It's about access, equitable access to transportation. And so when you think about school choice for families that don't necessarily have access to private vehicles, who may not live near transit, who may not be able to advocate for yellow bus service, there's a way in which who gets to make those choices is constrained. Not everyone has equal choice, in part because of the challenges of transportation. And we also have some early research that the burdens of additional travel in systems of choice disproportionately fall on low-income communities and communities of color. So again, the groups that we're actually trying to support by increasing access may be bearing the greatest burden and harm. In addition, it's not only about getting kids to the school building, right? It's about what happens in the school. And I think this is a space that as planners we spend even less time thinking about, potentially for good reason. There's plenty of people that spend a lot of time in conversations about education reform and education curriculum that probably have no business being there. And so I'm not suggesting that we add planners to that mix, but I think that it is important, again, to think about how our systems of transportation and sort of how we think about environments and how we craft environments does have this other downstream outcome, which is actually about students in classrooms, their health, their mental and physical health, their readiness to learn, and the kinds of ripple effects that these things have for teachers managing a classroom. So lack of transportation or unreliable transportation has real serious effects on absenteeism and tardiness. Tardiness and sort of mobility and flux in a classroom has effects not only for the student, the individual student, but actually affects classroom learning for all students in that community. We know a little bit less, unfortunately, about the mental and physical health impacts of long commutes for young people, but there is research on long commutes for adults, and we know that in long commute times, arduous, sitting in traffic actually creates additional stressors both physically and mentally for adults, and so we can kind of hypothesize that that is also happening for young people. There's some new research actually that just came out in JPER about a month ago that looks at lost sleep and loss of exercise with increased travel times, right? And so you can think, again, these are there's trade-offs, right? If you're commuting for an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, you're obviously not doing other things. You're waking up earlier, you're not sleeping as much, you're not getting as much exercise. And then in addition, we need to think about sort of what's the actual experience on a bus ride. So for young people who are traveling on transit, what does it mean to walk to a bus stop at 5 or 6 in the morning when it might still be dark? What is it like to wait at a bus stop? And then what's the quality of that ride once they're on the bus, both in terms of peer interactions and also interactions with adults and other riders. So I want to share with you two works in progress, one in Philadelphia and one in Baltimore, where I'm really trying to uncover and in some ways operationalize some of what these dynamics are about, right? So we know a fair amount about active travel and school travel. We have some questions that we sort of intuitively think, well, this must matter in some way, but we don't have a ton of research yet on how it matters or really unpacking that. And so that is kind of the space of this research, and I feel like I am joining and part of a community of growing scholarship in this space, which is also being held in part by your own Alex Karner, who's doing some great work in Davis and Sacramento as well around these issues, and there are other folks in public health and planning that are trying to get at this. So the first project that I'm going to share some selections from that I'm working on is in Philadelphia. It's a quantitative analysis that I've been working on with my colleague at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Jesus Barajas. And it's in the context of a growing charter school sector. So in Philadelphia, between 2000 and 2012, the charter school enrollment increased over 300%. Charter schools, for those of you that don't know, are sort of a market-based approach to educational equity, as I mentioned earlier. They are publicly funded, but they're privately managed schools. And their catchment areas, their attendance zones, are usually citywide. So they sort of have lotteries, and anyone can apply from anywhere. So as I mentioned, advocates of these policies argue that this kind of school choice mitigates against the negative impacts of residential segregation, right? Again, we're disaggregating neighborhood and school condition and composition. Critics are dubious of those claims and argue that charter schools, and there is evidence to this effect, deepen patterns of segregation actually at the school level. In I think it's safe to say most states, they negatively impact school district funding, so they challenge districts in delivering education overall. And there's also research that actually the bevy of choices that parents have actually feels like a burden. So the idea is that folks are empowered by having more choice and more information, but we actually have some research that tells us that parents actually feel overwhelmed by this, and actually what they want is like one school right there that they can just send their kid to and not think about. But reading this research, I was really curious about the other ways that burdens may play out, right? And does this extend to things that we collectively can think about and actually be agents of, which is transportation. And so this study looks at exactly that, at the transportation, the travel burdens of charter school enrollment in Philadelphia, and trying to understand how it affects household travel behavior in Philadelphia in terms of time and cost burdens. And then also, how are these burdens linked to neighborhood and school quality, right? So a burden, life is about trade-offs, right? We all know that, right? You open one door, you close another, right? That's the way it is. And we as individuals make trade-offs all the time, right? So the question is the burden, is the trade-off worth it? Right? What are families getting if they are traveling farther for longer, if they're maybe spending more money? Maybe they're getting something that payment is sort of worth it. But how can we really uncover that and understand that? So just real quickly, anyone know Philadelphia? Do we have any East Coasters in the room? 1.5. Okay, so I'll just give you a rough sketch of Philly. Again, this is like the speed demon version, so if you have clarifying questions, we could certainly take those up. But as I mentioned, the charter school enrollment kind of skyrocketed in this 10-year period, or 12-year period in Philadelphia. The district, Philadelphia School District, is the 8th largest in the country, and at this point about just over 30% of its students are enrolled in charter schools. Both the district and the charter-run public schools serve over 85% students of color, and they are overwhelmingly coming from families that are living in poverty, which is not very surprising. Philadelphia has one of or the highest poverty rate of any large city in the US. It's at 26%, and 1 in every 2.5 children are living in poverty. So the fact that the school district, again, is bearing that burden and trying to reach these young people is not surprising. The school district actually provides transportation for all students that live in the district boundaries, including charter and public, but also private and parochial students, which is kind of an interesting setup. So in thinking about sort of this travel burden, the other thing that Jesus and I wanted to do was think about what are the tools of planning that can contribute to this conversation. And one of the tools that we identified was the Regional Household Travel Survey. That we actually have data on school trips from the regional agency. And so we wanted to try to think about if methodologically this could be a resource to opening up a conversation in planning at the regional and at the city level around school transportation. And so we used the household travel survey data from 2012. And we're only looking at, what I'm talking about today is only at the charter and the public schools. And the 2012 survey, we were able to get restricted use confidential data that told us exactly what school the students were going to. And then of course in those surveys, we know the census tract that the students live in. So we were able to do some analysis on their home neighborhood, but also their home school, referencing that with data from the school district. And so today we're talking specifically about 173 school trips. We had, our initial finding that is not very surprising and is well-founded in other research is that charter school students, as compared to their public school counterparts, are traveling longer, about 8 minutes longer, and about a mile farther than their public school counterparts, which again is not very surprising. We sort of expected that, and we see that in research. But I want to share just 3 key findings that that sort of present a new or an additional set of puzzles, and sort of are suggestive of things that we are now looking more deeply at through thinking about both adding a qualitative component to this study and also trying to unpack the relationships by layering in some multivariate analysis, which this is not. And those are around issues of cost, around neighborhood safety, and around school quality. So the first thing is that we found a statistically significant difference in the burden between low and high income groups in terms of the cost that they're bearing, right? So the burden, low income groups are essentially bearing a higher proportion of their income to pay for school travel should it not be reimbursed by the district, which I will talk about in a minute. The data is also suggestive that low income charter school students are the most disproportionately burdened, right? So students coming from families that are opting out, they're making choices, are maybe perhaps paying the highest burden for this. So I commented earlier that in Philadelphia, the district pays for transportation, right? So students in public schools get what are called trans passes to ride the transit system. What's interesting is that in our sample, public school students who relied on public transit were more likely to use, they were using weekly transit passes, right? So these are, we can assume these were handed out by the district, by the principal when they get to school. But most of our charter school students in the sample were using tokens. Philly still has a token system. It's being phased out. But they were using tokens or cash, right? And I am pretty sure, and having talked anecdotally to some charter school leaders and teachers in Philadelphia, you know, I presented this work actually with a researcher who was a charter school teacher in Philly, and he said, no, I used to keep the transit passes in my front pocket and give them to kids. Like, there's no way that they were using tokens or cash. And I said, well, I'm glad your school was doing that, but what our data is saying is that there are some kids for whom I don't think they were being reimbursed, right? I don't think a charter school is giving a kid cash to go ride transit. And so this raises the question of what that policy and sort of implementation at the district level looks like. And again, who is paying out of pocket. The costs of transportation don't go away. Someone has to pay for them somewhere. So the next two set of questions are really about that charter population. And it's really trying to understand this question about, is it worth it? What are they getting for this? And so what we found was that charter school students were attending schools essentially in lower crime neighborhoods than if they had attended their neighborhood public school. So because Philadelphia does have choice, they also have a neighborhood assignment policy. So we were able to identify the school that the student was most likely to be assigned to if they had stayed in their quote unquote neighborhood school. And you can see that that only 5% of those students were living in communities where their neighborhood school was what would be considered a low crime neighborhood. And so what this tells us is that, you know, they were essentially opting into a charter school that was in a safer community than where they were going, than where they would have gone otherwise. And then we wanted to understand kind of a metric of school quality, which is imperfect, to say the least, but we use the state standardized test scores in math and reading, and we were able to see that on average, charter school students were essentially gaining a higher quality school as measured by these metrics than what their assigned public school would have been, right? So while there actually weren't differences in school quality between our students in our sample who attended public schools and charter schools, the charter school students essentially were leveling up to what the public schools were. I will note that leveling up brings us to a level of 60% proficiency or higher, right? So we still have 40% of students who are not reading or doing math on grade level. But nonetheless, the charter students are essentially getting out of a neighborhood public school in perhaps a less safe neighborhood that is delivering higher achievement results. So this study in Philly raises a couple of questions that are, you know, we need future research, right? Any good researcher will end their research by saying we need more research. But, you know, it's really this question about who bears the burden of choice, right? And our data is suggestive that lower income communities and sort of the most disadvantaged, that again, choice is trying to help, are actually most burdened. And so we need to understand a bit better if that trade-off's worth it. And this is where we're thinking about sort of more qualitative work, because we can't sort of quantify the worth it, right? We have to go talk to people and try to understand how people are making choices and how transportation access fits into school choice access and perceptions of neighborhood. On kind of a higher level, I think there's a really important question about where we invest, right? And this is sort of a policy planning question. In an ideal world, we would have unlimited resources where we would be adequately and excellently funding public transit systems, neighborhood improvement and development, affordable housing, and high quality public education, right? Unfortunately, that is not the world that we live in. These things should not be a zero-sum game, but they are often positioned as such. And the challenge of figuring out where and how to invest, particularly in the case, of many cities, but in the Philadelphia context, is that all of these decisions to invest are highly political. And they have their own political universe, right? So sort of transit investments and how those are managed have their own set of stakeholders, their own set of politics, neighborhood improvement, issues of gentrification, issues of persistent decline. There are different stakeholders, right, that are battling other fights with other sort of political powers. And then the school debate is its own thing as well, right? So should we be investing in transit when it's actually enabling charter school development, which charter school critics would argue is, at the end of the day, completely undermining public education, right? And so we could be really into promoting good transit and thinking about kids as transit riders and transit users, but is that actually undermining some other set of really important principles in society, which is about adequate and excellent funding in public education, right? And that's an added trade-off that as planners we don't usually think about, because we're thinking about the politics of place or the politics of our infrastructure systems, but they collide on the ground in really complicated ways. And then the last question from this study is sort of a little bit of a researcher tantrum, which is, why is our data so inadequate? And so part of our problem in answering and thinking about these questions, particularly through this quantitative analysis, is that we don't have enough data from a regional household survey, from even a city transportation perspective, because we don't care about school trips, right? And what gets measured gets done, right? We don't ask these questions, so we're not interested in collecting the data. And so we don't have the data, so we can't answer the questions, right? And so I think there's, I would like to see different perspectives on data collection. So that's kind of that's the Philadelphia case. And so I've recently moved to Maryland, and in getting to know my community there and the major city there, Baltimore. And this work is really sort of fresh and new. I've been working on this for the last 6 months, essentially, looking at student travel. And this is a qualitative study that I've been doing that actually looks at challenges of collaboration and governance, and sort of the collision of all of these politics when a transit agency is the agency that's primarily responsible for student travel in a school district. And in Baltimore, there's been a lot of political debate. It's been very much in the public discourse around the transit agency, but also issues with getting students to school. There was a big controversy with their student transit pass funding in the last year. And a lot of it is all sort of contextualized as sort of Baltimore has experienced kind of an existential split, and things are really described and talked about as sort of pre-Freddie Gray uprising and post, and sort of how students and young people and youth are criminalized or not, and how they navigate the city and what opportunities are available to them. These conversations have taken on a new saliency and a new intensity post-Freddie Gray, and student transportation was part of that. Just as a little bit of context, for those of you that watched any of that coverage a couple years ago, there was a decision made that no one in city government has yet to take responsibility for, to shut down the transit system. They shut down the transit system when most students were getting out of school and were at a central transfer point. And so when the news cameras came out, what it looked like was that there were throngs of students who were sort of in downtown looking to protest and looking to rally. When in fact, when you talk to those students, which many researchers at Johns Hopkins actually did and published a great report, most of those students were trying to get home, right? And they couldn't get home because someone said, this is crisis, we need to shut down the transit system, right? But you had all these students traveling transit. No one's taken responsibility for this. It's not really talked about anymore, although it's a very curious situation. But that is the context in which getting kids to school, the political and the racialized context in which getting kids to school is happening and being talked about in Baltimore. What's interesting is that no one is really talking about what's happening in the transit agency and how this affects fiscally and politically and operationally how the transit agency does its work. So I thought, well, I love transit agencies. I'm a staunch defender of government bureaucrats. I want to know how they're feeling. I want to know how does this affect your work, right? If we're really going to figure out as planners how to create seamless systems for young people, we need to understand how that system works and how the people in the system are managing it. I have a particular interest, and this is like the still to be done, but of actually talking to the frontline adults in this system who are bus operators. So I have yet to talk to bus drivers, but that is my, that's gonna be like the most fun. I wanna ride the bus and just interview bus drivers. And then also we need to really understand the student experience of riding transit so that we can triangulate across, again, all of these groups and really understand what is the system looking for and how effective is it. So Baltimore is similar to Philadelphia in that they have school choice, but they're different in that Maryland actually has a fairly hostile or tight control. It depends on sort of where you fall in the debate, but they do not have a very charter-friendly state legislation. And so Baltimore actually doesn't have a lot of charters, but they do have citywide open enrollment starting in middle school. So middle and high school students can go anywhere in the district. It was pointed out to me in a conversation before this talk. I just want to remind everyone, middle schoolers are 11. These are small children traveling and navigating the system. Like Philly, the majority of students in Baltimore's public schools come from low-income families. 90% of them are students of color. 81% of the students are African American. And again, there's a neighborhood assignment for K-5 and a select number of K-8 schools, but students sort of go everywhere. There's very little yellow bus service, really only for certain elementary school students and special ed. Interestingly, not for this talk, but this is also sort of a curious factoid that I think needs more investigation, is the district actually has a multi-million-dollar contract with a taxi cab company, primarily to transport homeless students. Because under federal legislation, homeless students who have unstable housing, districts are required to let them stay in their home school to provide them some level of stability. But that means that as they move around the city, either in foster care or in shelters or from home to home, that they may end up in like very curious spots relative to their school. So the district contracts with the Maryland Transit Agency, which is actually a state entity out of the State Department of Transportation. The department manages and the MTA manages light rail and buses, not only in Baltimore, but also the surrounding community. Students get what's called an S-Pass, a one-card pass. That's actually their school ID. And their bus pass. So I don't know if anyone's been in a high school recently, but many of these schools actually, you tag in for attendance. I don't know, we used to like get checked in and teachers would have to know how to pronounce everyone's name. That doesn't happen anymore. And then in addition to the transit pass system, where there's sort of a financial arrangement in terms of how much the district reimburses the transit agency, during peak travel time, so sort of morning rush and afternoon rush, the district or the MTA runs what are called tripper services, so supplemental bus services that are essentially additional lines that are on existing routes, but that go by schools. So they essentially add capacity on those lines. So in Baltimore, 60% of high school students are taking transit. They're riding primarily the public bus system. Some take light rail. And there is a subway in Baltimore. I don't know if anyone knows that. I didn't know it. One person knew it. I've never been on it, and people I know who live in Baltimore have never been on it, but they're like, we have this subway. It goes here and here. And notably, 68% of the high school students that are taking transit have at least one transfer to get to school, right? So they have, that's a large percentage that have at least a 2-seat ride, if not more. And this compares with system-wide, only about 47% of riders have a transfer, right? So high school students have much more complicated travel routes than even many of the riders. And the last thing to note is that in the last year, actually in June, the transit agency redesigned its entire bus system. And so this was sort of a political minefield, and early studies of the proposed system, and then there's work trying to evaluate it since it's been up and running for about 6 months, have shown that some schools were going to see less service and some were going to see more, but there really wasn't a ton of attention given to students or to high school routes in that redesign issue.
Can I ask you a question about that advertisement?
Yeah.
Was that an ad from the transit agency asking Joe Flacco to pay for the service?
So no, this came from Bill Ferguson, who's a council person, and this is the controversy that happened. So the MTA, what they did was they didn't cut the transit pass, they cut the hours that the transit pass could work at the beginning and the end of the day. And people were upset. City council actually held a bake sale to raise money. They raised about $50,000. Obviously, I mean, a significant amount of money from a bake sale. But also more of sort of demonstrated kind of the political nature. I mean, I think critics would argue that it was like a political stunt, right? It was political theater to sort of make this issue rise to the top, led by a few council people, one of whom, not Bill Ferguson, is a former Teach for America alum and has sort of taken on youth development and education in the city as his kind of mantle in city council. What ended up happening was to fill this gap that the MTA said that they had, the council put in their $50,000 of brownie money, and then the Ravens chipped in another 50, and the CEO of Under Armour, which is headquartered in Baltimore, put in another 50 and filled the gap until the district and the transit agency could negotiate sort of what would happen. So that essentially that was going to cut off students like in October or something ridiculous like that for. So there was sort of all this brouhaha and like, please save our transit passes. So I'm going to present some more. This is the first time these quotes have seen the light of day out of my computer, because I've done a handful of initial interviews, and so I'm trying to, again, kind of triangulate this data and understand kind of what people are thinking about. But one thing that is emergent is that the system of choice, this open enrollment system in Baltimore, is creating burdens for students and for the MTA. And as this MTA staffer said to me, kids are saying it takes so long to get to school. And he feels bad. He feels bad, right? But the question is, when you made these choices, did you think about transportation? Did you look at the bus map before you chose to go to that school in the opposite corner of the city from where you lived? The staffer went on to talk about how he's not judging, that he understands what the educational options are in the city, and that he doesn't begrudge anyone trying to get into a higher quality school, but at the end of the day, we can't create a unique ride for you. And this consultant working with MTA sort of expressed a similar thing, not only about individual rides, but actually year over year, enrollment is so dynamic in school districts, particularly school districts that are serving high poverty families who are very unstable and move around a lot. And so MTA can't do their routing. For those of you, how many of you are in sort of a transportation world? So a handful of you, right, are learning about routing, learning about service planning, right? This is a complex situation. Students are sort of one corner of riders, and they can't really be expected to design the whole system around them, especially because, as she said, these are shifting sands. They're changing all the time, right? That is no way to design a system. The other thing is that I think what is often understated for transit agencies, particularly around school transportation, is that they are subject to so many competing and complicating sets of regulations and policy mandates. And this is just one example, which is that the FTA regulates school tripper service, which is the supplemental bus service. And this is a law that's essentially set up to privilege private charter bus companies. And so just transit agencies cannot provide supplemental service that deviates in any sort of major way. I'm not sure. They have to be minimal deviations, I think is the language in the law. And this MTA staffer, again, wants to give rides to kids, both politically and kind of like philosophically. But he talked a lot about the gamble, a lot about how he had to push the envelope. And they did things that he thinks run afoul of the FTA administration rules, right? And the stakes are high. They violate these rules, they get punished, right? They lose money. But he wants to sort of take a gamble. So this also shows us how the decisions about this routing and planning, these are not just technical questions where we can sort of throw up a model and figure out what it looks like. These are individual decisions that the orientation, the politics, the philosophy of the individual staff person who's willing to navigate politics in one way or the other is empowered to make those choices, right? And this guy is, I mean, I would say like a mid-level bureaucrat, right? But he's the one that's making the choice about where to push and where not to, with these sort of macro, that the entire agency is subject to these high-level regulations. And this is like, again, an unsurprising comment, but I think in addition to the competing regulations, we have to think about the politics of this. And I talked a little bit about the complexity of politics in the Philadelphia example, right, about transit and education and working across purposes and one undermining the other. And what I've heard from the MTA staff that I've talked to and some transit advocacy, nonprofit advocacy groups, is that in some ways they all, when you talk to them individually, this is sort of the joy of being a researcher, like they all kind of agree. But when it all like comes out in the mix, there's all this tension, right? So it's like, how do we figure out how to puzzle through that? But the advocates, really, their perception is that MTA doesn't care about students. They think they're a drain on resources and that they want nothing to do with them, and that if they could never run student transportation again, they would be happy. MTA staff say that they hear from bus drivers that if they never had to drive another student route, they would be happy, right? These are not the routes that people want. As he says, all he hears is different levels of dislike, which is one of the favorite things I think an interviewee has ever said to me. And then they have all these other riders. So patrons are pissed. They're making changes to bus stops. They don't want to be on buses with kids. They don't want to wait at bus stops with kids. They're concerned about safety. And so these are all the tensions that the MTA has to worry about. And then I've been able to do some initial conversations, I wouldn't say formal focus groups yet, but with some young people who, again, express concerns that we sort of hypothesize and that other research has demonstrated that students have to wait a really long time. They're getting up. Many of them are living in very unsafe neighborhoods and getting up very early and walking alone to bus stops in the dark. Buses are crowded, which means bus drivers often pass them up. So they have to, then wait on a bus line that might have a 20 or 30-minute headway to get to school, which is not going to get them to school on time. They feel disrespected by drivers a lot. And one student actually said, that these transportation logistics, when we think about is it worth it, it's not worth it. School is a place that is not welcoming to many young people, particularly young people of color in high poverty communities. Schools are not reaching them. We are failing students more than students are failing in schools. And this student articulated that. Why am I going to do that? Why am I going to get up at 5 in the morning to deal with an obnoxious bus driver who might not even pick me up to get to a place that I don't even want to be, right? And so if our transportation system is in part responsible for losing this young person and her potential and her value and her intellect in the world, I think that needs to give us as planners a lot of pause, because these are the stakes, right? This young person is the stakes of what we're doing and how we're designing our systems. So I think I'll stop there, because it's always best to stop with the words of non-researchers when they make the message. But these are just some of the questions are still unanswered. The first is really, how are people making choices, right? That point by the MTA staff are like, well, did you think about transportation? We actually don't know how parents and families make these decisions, either for schools or for transportation access or how they interact. We don't have good information about that. How does thinking about the stakes of transportation, the stakes of that young woman not going to school, how does that change how we think about all of our work in planning? And really, what happens when we don't think about schools, right? Where does that leave us, both in terms of populations that we're working with, but also what our communities will look like, right? What will our cities and our regions and our suburbs, what will they be if we're not thinking about schools and not thinking about young people? So that's what I got. So thank you for your attention. And I welcome questions and feedback, and I'm sort of hoping that you will have probing questions that will actually get added to my research agenda, so please bring them. Yeah, here, I'm here.
So I grew up in Maryland where there was no charter schools in my district, just experimenting with open enrollment when I was there. So I'm probably really naive to this, but are systems of school choice here to stay and growing, and should we be planning for their inevitability?
Yeah, I think so. Where did you grow up in Maryland?
Anne Arundel County.
Anne Arundel, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing that's really important, and why I think this puzzle really matters. And again, this community of scholars I've been working with, I think, kind of acknowledge this. In planning, the folks that have thought the most about schools and school politics have really been folks who work on housing and community development. And this comes out of a long history and tradition in planning that actually comes out of design, right? And there's this normative ideal of a neighborhood school at the center of a lovely gridded community, right? And it is both a physical and a social center for the community. That's not really the reality in schooling anymore. And so the ways that planners think about schools, I think, is a little antiquated. Like, we kind of have to catch up. And I don't think school choice is going anywhere, right? I mean, it's highly political. I certainly have my own political perspectives, which I'm not shy to share, but they're sort of moot, because at the end of the day, as a planning scholar, I'm a pragmatist, right? And so what is the world in front of us? And I think people want choices. And I also think I've been doing some work with school districts that run magnet school programs as part of desegregation programs. And there are lots of school districts that are doing school choice in ways that are, I think, important and not necessarily as subject to the polarizing politics of districts that are doing it via charter schools. So like Nashville, for example, is one district. They have a countywide school district, and they have a voluntary desegregation plan. And so they have implemented what's called a controlled choice system, where they essentially break their county up into relatively large zones, right, in part to manage transportation logistics. But within that zone, you might be assigned to kind of a walkable school, but you also could choose any other school in that zone. Some of those schools have specialized programs. Magnet schools sort of emerged in the 60s in large part to keep white middle-class families in urban schools, to try to integrate the schools. And so I think that the value and the objectives and goals of school desegregation are, I mean, I think they're worthy. I think when you look at the data around segregated school. I mean, we've never had a segregated school that serves segregated children of color in terms of academic performance or reading levels or sort of, long-term sort of income gains, right? We just don't have that. And so I think the idea that we want to desegregate schools to address that issue is a worthy goal, but it creates kind of management complications. So Nashville has this controlled choice thing, which most districts do, but I was at this conference and this guy from, I think, Lansing, Michigan, raised his hand. We were talking about transportation logistics, and he said, well, we just instituted choice as part of a deseg plan, and we added magnets, and we're not a big district, but students can go to any school anywhere they want. And essentially when that enrollment decision was made, no one brought in the people from the transportation office in the school district. So now they're like, their heads are exploding and they're like, what are we gonna do? Like, how do we get, right, again, they have neighborhoods where they have like 10 kids that are going like 7 different schools, like and they have yellow school busing, right? They don't have like a robust transit system right now, right, public transit system. So there's a lot of considerations that need to be made but this is, I think, actually another opportunity for planners, particularly in the transportation sector, to collaborate and to use our skills in a way that are maybe in unexpected arenas or unexpected institutions or agencies. So actually at the University of Maryland, there's a team of civil engineers who are, transportation engineers who actually have built a model and have worked, I think actually with Anne Arundel maybe and Howard County school districts to optimize their yellow school bus routing, right? We have, I mean, not me, but many of you have the power and the knowledge in terms of transportation models that actually we could bring that knowledge to bear for school districts in a way that would be really helpful. Yeah, you had another question, and then Jake.
So you mentioned it's political multiple times. One of the challenges that I felt was that when we're in class and when we're talking to professors or anything, there's always this expectation that we are going to be apolitical, we're going to keep our own political opinions away from the data analysis. And so I'm not American, but there's lots of things I notice about the way people, so for example, the quote about they don't want to wait at bus stops with children. Like, where do you see the role of planners in trying to change opinions in a social context without compromising our, seeming, there's a different word, but without, compromising the fact that we're supposed to be not unbiased.
Right, so I don't know who's teaching those classes. But I think that's not how I think about planning, right? I don't think there is a way, data is inherently political. How we construct models is inherently political. We are making choices all the time as researchers and as planners. What's in and what's out. What questions are we asking? How are we defining problems? And how we define problems dictates what solutions and what the universe of potential solutions are, right? And so that's part of my sort of life's project, right, is this question of how do we center schools? Because if we center schools, if we center young people, if we think about the stakes of losing a young person in the world because we built a transportation system or built, an affordable housing policy, right, that doesn't give them what they need, that's not apolitical because we were looking at our model. That's just as political. The absence of something is also a political choice, right? So I think some of it is about reframing how we think about our work. And I think this is where, again, and I'm still trying to dig at this because it's new and I'm not 100% sure, but this, the conversations I've had with some MTA staff are really interesting to me because they see themselves as technical service planners, right? That have a technical skill with a set of data. They get the data from the district. They put it in their model. But when I talked to one of them in particular, he was making political choices. He made a call about how to publish the school bus, supplemental bus service schedule that he literally said, I think this runs afoul of the federal regulation. I think we're in violation, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? That's a political choice, right? And so when you think about sort of the work you're doing both in the classroom, but also when you head out into the world, and for those of us that are in faculty or researchers, right, the choices we make about our areas of study, I just think all of that is political, right? And it's about our values, and it's about the world we want to create. I think particularly for planners, more than many other professions, because the gift and privilege of this work is that we are the people that get to imagine and then help enable the future, right? I mean, it sounds kind of cheesy, but right, we're future oriented. So we have to make choices about what we think that future should look like. And we do it all the time. Bike lanes, we should have bike lanes. We should have less cars. We should have congestion pricing. We shouldn't have sprawl. These are political choices. So I don't know why these would be any different, right? But maybe you hear something else in class. Jake, did you have a question?
I was just wondering what, as I was listening to you go through your talk, what some of these issues might look like in a not transit-rich or walkable city like this. And I know you're just starting out and
Right.
you've got lots of work to do in Baltimore and Philadelphia, but I was just kind of running through some of these issues. Like, for example, somewhere like Austin, it might just be physically impossible to expect students to use the public transit system to reach many of the schools in the city.
Right, so then I think the calculus then, again, as I said briefly, like the costs of transportation don't evaporate because we've decided on a new assignment policy, right? Or because the school board has decided that transportation is not a core educational function, so we're zeroing that line out. Like, that doesn't mean the cost goes away, it just goes away for them. So I think, the calculus is sort of who are the stakeholders or the set of actors, and then the landscape of what that burden looks like. So in a place like Austin, which I'm less familiar with, but if the transit system doesn't have that kind of reach, or the geography is such that would not work, the district probably has a different calculus, number one, about how they manage their costs and logistics of yellow school buses, that they probably are confronting that reality because it's their reality. But I also think that then we need to think about private transportation, meaning, parents, right? Like, how is that burden shifted to parents? And it varies in community, because in many communities, you could have people that are like living in poverty, but that means that they still have a car, right? And in other communities, high poverty, you would never, right? I mean, you would never think to have a car, right? That's sort of an expendable thing that you wouldn't have unless you had disposable income, but the morphology of the place you're in depends on that. I think the other thing is that thinking about, and this is not work that I do, because again, I'm sort of the Baltimore Philly person, but the issue of rural school transportation is also really huge, because we know that rural poverty is also really significant, right? And so the challenges of what that looks like in a geography that, it kind of baffles my mind in terms of sort of scale and spread. I don't know what you do with that. And then, some people say actually that what's going to happen is I'm teaching a seminar on planning education, and I had an education student who said, well, I don't really endorse this, but I can see why these kinds of complications in transportation lead people to think we should move to online learning, right? Like, forget going to a school building. Kids just stay in their house, right? Which is a really bad idea, just so you know. The research on online learning is like really bad. Don't do that. But you have to think about new configurations in that way. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Then we have some.
Here in Austin, they're kind of undergoing a big bus system redesign, kind of like, I'm assuming probably similar to Baltimore's, where they straighten all the routes, increase the frequency, and part of that is also cutting service. I'm not sure of all the high schools, but definitely 3 high schools that I know of are just going to be served like once or twice a day, probably by buses at kind of one at the end of school, one at the beginning of school, kind of thing. And to me, that doesn't really passed the smell tests. So how do you kind of see that kind of level of awareness of the school commute being brought into that, kind of what is essentially a very opaque transit agency's decision making?
There are many things in that question. So, yeah, I mean, your last comment that it's an opaque transit agency, I was going to ask the question, do you know what kind of outreach or community process they had with school stakeholders? But it sounds like maybe I could assume none if it's an opaque transit agency. But in a world, you could imagine a universe where actually, as long as there's enough volume of service at the beginning and the end of the school day hours, that's actually fine. And one thing that a lot of cities across the country and school districts grapple with like student transit passes is how you limit them, because you don't actually want transit passes to enable truancy, right? So that you don't want them to work in the middle of the day, because kids are supposed to be in school, not in school. I think one place where that gets into trouble, where it would be lovely to see more district transit agency collaboration, is that there are other reasons, again, besides getting kids to a school building, that they need access to transit. So what's also missed is sort of out of school time activities, so access to extracurricular activities, to jobs, to family responsibilities. Many high schools actually have innovative programs through career academies that have internships or co-op models, right, where kids are actually getting to work during the school day, right? So how do they get there? There's also a big push around dual enrollment, where kids in high schools actually are also taking classes at a community college and getting college credit at the same time, right? So there's all these, again, I think the challenge is that the educational landscape is complex, and as we evolve and innovate that from an educational curricular side, planners aren't keeping a pace with that. And I don't want to say, again, that we should all become education experts, because we're different experts and that has value. But we have to figure out a way that we can sort of get a clue about what's happening in the education space, because the models of how we plan, both from kind of a neighborhood planning perspective and now a transportation infrastructure perspective, are based on what's kind of an antiquated model of education. And so I don't know how we do that, but that's kind of the charge that I'm trying to uncover in the research, and that talking to students and in my teaching, my hope is that, plant seeds, so, because you guys are actually going to be the ones going out and practicing and having to do this. So one more question?
Are parents making residential decisions based on charter schools, or are charter school decisions something that happen kind of secondarily? And if they are making residential decisions based on charter schools, in the future, could we imagine neighborhoods based on students attending specific charter schools?
So I don't think we have good data on that. We know that parents make choices based on schools, but again, that assumes a neighborhood catchment area. There is some work that's trying quantitatively to sort of apply those housing location choice models to see if, and actually also looking at, like there's some concern in the world of gentrification and schools and gentrification, that actually what charter schools will do will open up more communities to be vulnerable to gentrification. So for example, if I, if I as a gentrifier, right, need cheap housing, but I have a kid and I want to live in a city, well, suddenly I'm willing to live in neighborhood X, even though I know I would never send my kid to that school, because I know that the district has a choice option. So I can get my cheap housing in this neighborhood. I'm willing to take the risks affiliated, that gentrifiers perceive as risks living in, a disinvested neighborhood. I'm not taking the risk with my kid because I can get them elsewhere. But we don't really understand kind of that relationship very well. I think the one hiccup with that is that charter schools, for the most part, are required in most places to have district-wide enrollment, right? Like that's the point. And so they're never going to be geographically based. So what would be the motivation of locating next to the school? Obviously walking to school, right? Some people want to walk to a neighborhood school, and so, but.
And the social benefits.
Right, and if there are perceived social benefits, right. Again, I think living near a school has lots of benefits, but in thinking about what we know about housing choice and what we do know about how parents, particularly parents with choices, make school choices, I don't know. I'm not quite sure. And this is also a debate kind of in the charter education world, is like, to what extent do charter schools mean that schools are no longer place-based institutions? And then what is lost with that, right? Which I think a lot. So, but it's a good question, and there's lots of researchers that are actually trying to operationalize an answer. So.
Well, I guess I have to stop the conversation. Well, by the way, Brendan, you were once a school bus driver.
I was a bus driver.
You were?
Not a school bus driver, but yeah.
That's amazing. Can I talk to you? Can I interview you?
I hate picking up like high school students.
You did,
I didn't have a route that did that.
but your colleagues hated it.
Loathed it,
Yeah.
Maybe one of your
I would like to talk to you about your bus driver comrades. Yes, please. Awesome.
great.
Yeah, sorry to go over, but
Well,
thank you.
I guess as always, I will share with you my kind of thoughts after each speaker talks. And here, I think Professor Bierbaum brought in a topic that we probably have not paid enough attention. We paid attention, but not enough attention in terms of the school-centered issues, so whether it's transportation, education, or equally others. Think about our location choice behavior, or really the classic theory, probably has touched upon it, but not enough to cover the current behavior of home location choice decisions and others. And think about myself, experience of coming to Austin. I think Jake probably as well, and Claudia, Sarah, and others who have children when they move into the town. The first thing they ask, what, after being offered the job? School.
Right.
Whether it's elementary school or high school or others. So we totally different choice behavior, and lots of things that we have not researched on enough, whether it's at the theoretical level, operational, maximization, minimization, operational level, or legal other aspects. And lots of the topics worth pursuing, or even probably thinking about beyond the box. School districts that then make decisions, and what about things that we can make changes so that school districts can change it in a different way. So with that, let's conclude the semester's series.
Thank you.